Now let's examine one of white's lesser options, which begins after the initial moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5, a6, bishop a4, and knight f6. So just to recap in general, our plan is to play b5 and bishop c5 almost regardless of what white does. If white castles, if white plays knight c3, if white plays d3, if white plays queen e2, and so on. Of course, d4 is one way to avoid the archangel, as we've seen already. And that's probably the only way which white really can effectively do so, or at least create some sort of independent and creative positions. There is one other option, but it's just not a good one, and that is the move c3. Now this does indeed avoid b5 because b5 is met with bishop c2, and then if a bishop comes out to c5, suddenly d4 hits the bishop, hits the pawn d5, and white gains the center. Black was not able to play d6 to fortify the center, as we know we have to do. The problem with c3 is, of course, that we take on e4. Now this, you can call it sort of an open Spanish. The difference with the open Spanish is that usually white is castled there, and then can play rook e1 ideas, d4, and have rook e1 in the cards, or queen e2, anything to use the open e-file. In fact, if we go back, after castle knight e4, white plays d4, and if black makes this mistaken move, e takes d4, we'll have a look at the move 5 d4 chapter to see the refutation of this. So, and of course white plays rook e1 here. So that's the point, that after castle, knight e4 is the open Spanish, and white can try to utilize the open e-file. In case of c3, this is simply a dubious move because we take on e4, and white is not in time to try to use the e-file at all. And black is simply going to get a better position here. For example, if castle, we play knight to c5, very typical, targeting the bishop on a4. If it goes back to c2, we're simply up a pawn. White has not created any threats, and we can play e4 and so on. And in case of bishop c6, we play d takes c6, capturing away from the center. We're familiar with this idea. And after knight e5, white has regained the pawn, but what is this pawn doing on c3? There's a giant hole on d3, black has an unopposed light squared bishop, and those factors combined mean that black has a big advantage. And the way to exploit that is with the move knight d3, plugging the hole on the d3 square. Queen e2, we simply take and play bishop e6, and we continue with queen d7, long castle, and then we target the queen on e5. Black has the bishop pair, a development advantage after queen d7 long castle, and will gain a lot of time on white's queen, and also white has a lot of weak light squares. So black stands much better. And white can also try to regain the pawn immediately with queen e2. We simply play knight c5 again. In case of knight takes c5, be a little bit cautious. Don't play knight takes a4 because knight c6 would win the queen on d8 with discovered check. So instead, now we have a bunch of good moves here. Knight takes e5, for example, is a good move. But I especially like queen e7. The point is, if knight c6, we take on e2, king e2, and knight takes a4. We have both the bishop pair in the endgame, and also after knight d4, we can start to get our pawns rolling, and we will have an advantage by every metric. So this is just better for black. And also bishop c6, d6, again, capturing away from the center, opening up the bishop to go to f5. For example, castle bishop f5, we are threatening f6. We will probably see a trade of queens, and d3 is a big weakness. All I can think of is, why did white play c3? This is a terrible move, weakening d3, cutting off your knight, giving up the bishop pair. It's just all wrong for white. And after d4, again, you have a choice. If you want knight d7, just trading knights is a good move. Or f6 is also a good move. Now, if the knight moves, you have knight to d3 check, among other good things, but knight d3 check is very strong. And in case of dc5, fe5, followed by bishop to f5, long castle, try to utilize that d3 square. Again, why did white play c3? Black just has an advantage. And after knight c5, bishop c6 is more logical. Again, we take away from the center, the usual, to try to open up this bishop. Also threatening knight d3. Now, in case of knight e5, you simply play bishop e7, you castle short. After d4, you drop the knight back to e6, and with the bishop pair, black stands a little bit better. Not a whole lot, but still, white has not only given up the possibility to fight for the advantage, but also has given black the advantage. d4, knight e6, again, as I mentioned, knight e5, simply bishop to e7 or bishop d6, either one. The choice is yours, followed by short castle, and black is better. And after d takes e5, at least white has created a pawn majority. But here we have a lot of good choices. Again, you can try to target that d3 square, or you can just develop castle, castle, rook d1, queen to e8. There's no reason to be concerned here. Black stands slightly better. Black will continue with c5, b6, bishop b7, getting a beautiful diagonal there. Maybe queen c6 to activate the queen. Then you take over the d-file. You can play some small moves like h6. White has weak light squares. This pawn on c3 provides no function. This bishop is obstructed by the pawn on e5. This is a well blockaded pawn. Black has excellent pieces, and the only thing that you need to do is activate that bishop on the diagonal. b6, c5, bishop b7. Black stands better. And that is the move c3. It's not a good move. There's no reason that anyone should be playing this move. If your opponent plays it, you should just thank them for making such a silly move. Take the pawn on e4, get the bishop pair, and then try to beat them, because you already stand better. So if your opponent makes moves like this in the opening, then by all means try to punish them.